Solving quadratic equations using the square root method. So, last time we learned how to solve quadratic and other equations using the factoring method. So let's do that with this example. X squared minus 81 equals to 0. Our first step is to set one side of the equation equal to 0, and that is actually done for us, so we do not have to do step number 1. Step number 2, factor completely. On the left, this is a difference of squares, so it factors into conjugates, where x times x gives me x squared, 9 times 9 gives you 81, and then they are opposite signs, one addition and one subtraction, and that is still equal to 0. That is factored completely, so that finishes step number 2. Now, since we have something times something equal to 0, we can split it apart using the principle of zero products. That tells us the first is equal to 0 or the second is equal to 0. Both of those will give us a solution to this problem. So we have finished step number 3. Step number 4, these are both linear equations, so we can solve them by isolating the variable. So let me subtract 9 from my left-hand side, which cancels it out. Gives me the solution x is equal to negative 9. My right-hand one, when I add 9 to both sides, that gives me the solution of x is equal to positive 9. Now, depending on which way the homework asks for it, you might have one of two ways to input your answers. If it asks for the solution set, you need to put your answer in the braces, where you have negative 9, comma 9, or in the other order. If it does not ask for the solution set, if it just asks for what your variable is equal to, then you can just put in your numbers with a comma in between. You do not need the braces. So one of these two here will be your final answer. So that is finishing step number 4. Now, step number 5 says make sure you check. First, we need to check that we have the correct number of answers. This is a degree 2 problem, so we should have 2 answers, and we do. The second thing that we need to do is we need to double check that each of those answers works out the way that it should. Now, in another part of this video, I will be checking these 2 answers, but I'm going to leave it as it is for right now. Alright, there is another way to solve this exact same problem. It is using the square root method. So before we learn the steps of the square root method, there is a principle that we need to learn. So let's review the principles that we had before. Our first principle was the one that we used for linear equations. It said, when you did something to one side of the equation, then you need to do it on the other side of the equation to cancel it out. Make sure you do it in addition and subtraction, before multiplication or division, almost PEMDAS, reverse order. Then last time in the factoring one, we learned the principle of zero products. It said, if you have something multiplied by something, and if it is equal to 0, then you can split this apart. The only thing that will make this equation true is if your first factor is equal to 0, or if your second factor is equal to 0. Now, to solve it using the square root method, we have to use the principle of square roots. It says, when you force in a square root, then you must also force in a plus and a minus. You must also force in both a positive and a negative. And the reason that this is because if we do it in reverse order, so if we had something squared, if we had a positive number squared, positive times positive is going to give us a positive answer. If we have a negative number squared, that is a negative times a negative, which also gives us a positive answer. So if we square things and it cancels out both the positive and the negative, then we need to remember that when we do the opposite order, if we square root things, we need both the positive and the negative. So now that we know this principle, let us learn the steps to solving an equation using the square root method. Now, the key to this method is that this only works when there is one variable. If there is more than one variable, then you cannot solve it using the square root method. So if your equation is like what we had before, x squared minus 81 equals 0, notice that there is only one variable here. So we can solve it by isolating that variable. If your equation was something like x squared plus 3x is equal to 0, you cannot solve this using the square root method because there is an additional variable here which we will not be able to isolate. So this method only works when there is a single x squared involved. If you can set it up that way, your steps are going to be isolating the variable, or if it's a quantity squared, you need to isolate the quantity square, and you do that by your linear equation principles. You do opposite operations to cancel things out, adding or subtracting before you multiply or divide. Step number 2, to get rid of that square, you force in the square root. Now don't remember that principle that you just learned. If you force in a square root, then you must also force in both a positive and a negative. At this point, you should be able to solve for your variable by completely isolating the variable, and then you're to your last step, which is to check. Make sure you have the correct number of answers, and make sure that those answers check completely out. Okay, let's go back to this last example here, but let's solve it by using the square root method. Now we can use the square root method on this problem because it is a single x term. So our job is to isolate the x. We do that by performing opposite operations. So I'm going to add my 81 to the opposite side. So that leaves me with x squared is equal to 81. So I have finished step number 1 in isolating the variable. Step number 2, to cancel out that square, I must force in a square root because those are opposite operations. If I do it on the left, then I must also do it on the right. But if I force in a square root, then I also need to force in both a positive and a negative. So I'm going to put my plus or minus here with my root 81. On the left, the square and the square root cancels out. That's why you put it in there in the first place, isolating your x variable. On the right, you have both positive and negative, and when you simplify the square root of 81, that gives you the answer of 9. So we have the exact same answers that we did with the factoring method, both positive 9 and negative 9. It's just written in a different format. If you would like, you are more than welcome to split this up as x is equal to positive 9 and negative 9 as well. Most of the time we don't do that though, because this is a condensed version of the other. And in math, we like to keep things in the most simplified version. Alright, I told you I would check it when I did it by factoring, so let's go ahead and check this answer here. So first let's check the solution of x is equal to positive 9. And we do that by plugging in 9 for all of my x's in this equation. So that gives me x squared minus 81, and we want to confirm that it actually equals 0. So 9 squared gives me positive 81, and of course 81 minus 81 does give me 0. So the solution of x equals 9 checks out. Let's check my other solution of x is equal to negative 9. And again, I do that by going back to my original equation and plugging in that negative 9 for any place I see x. So we have negative 9 all squared minus 81, and again we're trying to confirm that this is equal to 0. Well, negative 9 times negative 9 gives me a positive 81, and a positive 81 minus 81 of course gives me 0. So my second solution checks as well. So if I go back up here, that tells me that I do have the correct solution. So I have checked it. And don't forget to check that you have the correct number of solutions. This is a degree 2 problem, and I should have 2 solutions. And I do. So I have my final answer here of x equals positive and negative 9. Now that's where I'm going to stop this video. I'm going to do a second video here in a moment, and that is going to be showing you 3 more examples of solving using the square root method.